These pictures are moments that media has immortalized. Pictures taken by Peter Turnley, an American photographer that also loves Cuba and has been visiting this country for 30 years. Faces, emotions, and challenges, all in the lens of this man that has been in some of the most important moments of this island history. Now he shows his pictures in a museum in Havana. Moments of the Human Condition is the name of this exhibition, the first solo of an American photographer in Cuba. He also has a book called The Grace of a Spirit, strictly about passages of the Cuban life.
This exhibition is called Momento de la Condición Humano, which means Moments of the Human Condition, and it's a retrospective of 40 years of my photographs from more than 90 countries around the world. The title of the exhibition, Momento de la Condición Humano, refers to the fact that my interest in photographing life has always been about sharing my observations, perceptions, and feelings about the world that I witness and I encounter. And my notion of life involves being interested and curious about all aspects of life, from moments that are when life is at its best, that are both tender, poetic, soft, full of love, and marvelous, to the other extreme when life involves hardship, injustice, oppression, unfairness, difficulty, war, conflict, when life could be much better, and then everything in between. For me, this is what life is all about, all of these things.
And 40 years of work, right?
That's right. The exhibition covers photographs that were taken from 1971 to the present. And I worked in now more than 90 countries around the world. I first started photography when I was 16 years old. Until that point, the only way that I knew how to express myself was physically. I was very athletic. And then I had a knee injury, and I was in a hospital bed in my hometown in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in the center of the United States, the heartland of America. And my parents brought me a book of the great French photographer, Henri Cartier-Bresson. And as I laid in bed and I looked at this man's photographs, I was blown away by the way in which his vision informed me that there were all these moments of life that I was walking by without noticing. So I bought a camera, and starting at the age of 16, I started to, every night after school, walk the streets of my hometown. I came from a family, even though I'm from a region of the United States that is politically very conservative, my own family was very, very liberal, very progressive in their politics. My father had a lot of passion for human justice and for civil rights. And there was a lot of discussion around my house about the notion that people should be judged only by the content of their character and not by anything else. And it was my early days in photography were at a very exciting time in the history of the United States and the history of the world. It was the late 60s, so the Vietnam War was going on, the civil rights movement was at its peak, it was the beginning of feminism. It was a time when probably most people of that age didn't agree with the values of their parents, where everything was in question. So this was kind of the backdrop of my beginnings of my viewing the world. Overnight, I discovered that the camera and photography offered me a voice, a chance to speak, but also often to offer a voice to people whose voice too often goes unheard.
So, being in this museum, Peter, this is like the best museum of Cuba, right?
This exhibition is one of the most beautiful honors of my life. I've been told by the museum that I'm the first North American photographer since the Cuban Revolution to be offered a major solo exhibition in Cuba's most important institution. And I've been photographing now for the last 40 years, since I was 16 years old. I'm now 60 years old. And I've had the wonderful opportunity to both be present and witness many, if not most, of the important world news stories of the last 3 decades, and to be present when really fundamental moments of history and change were taking place. I was present in Berlin in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. I witnessed all of the revolutions in Eastern Europe at the end of the 90s. I spent 15 years from 1986 to 2000 photographing in the former Soviet Union and Russia, and I saw the whole process of perestroika and glasnost. I spent many years photographing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East. I was present in China in 1989 during the Tiananmen Square student uprising. And I also was present in South Africa when Nelson Mandela walked out of 27 years of prison, which was actually one of the most beautiful and exciting moments that I've ever seen. And it was incredibly powerful to witness the force and the human strength of the anti-apartheid struggle and to see the end of apartheid in South Africa.
In that sense, I have a question. When you are in such an important moment, at least that has happened to me, you get like super excited, super nervous. So how do you focus or concentrate to not think about all that and think about the picture?
Well, I'm not sure that in fact that it works like that. I think it's a little bit the opposite. I always say that I think that the camera is simply a tool. I'm more interested in the themes of life that I photograph than, in fact, photography itself. But I believe very strongly in the ability for photographs to touch the hearts of people that see them, just like moments touch me. So in many ways, I think photography has a lot in common with athletics, with sports. You know, great basketball players have spent their whole life shooting baskets. But when their team is behind by 1 point and there's only 1 second on the clock, that's not the time to be thinking about how you shoot the basket. It's the time you have to win the game. And in photography, it's very much the same way, where you've been photographing for a long time, you know the camera, you know the technique, you know the gestures, and there's this really beautiful feeling where when something really important is going on, one can get into a form of a zone where everything just kind of flows. And on the contrary, rather than thinking about photography, when I'm seeing really important moments, what I'm thinking about is, how can I communicate what I'm seeing in the most powerful way with a photograph so that when people look at this moment, they feel it the same way that I'm feeling it.
And even though you've been in so many important places in the world, you've photographed so many people and so many conflicts and so many beautiful things too. Why Cuba? Why was interesting for you?
I first came to Cuba
in 1989, right?
The first trip I ever made to Cuba was 1989. I flew from Moscow with Mikhail Gorbachev on a plane that accompanied the Soviet premier, and he was on a state visit to visit Fidel Castro. And there's been one constant throughout my life of travel and photojournalism, and that has been a sense that I have a role and an opportunity and also a responsibility to have access to a world that often many people don't have access to seeing. And I have embraced those opportunities. And this was true when I was working in the Eastern Bloc in Eastern Europe at the height of the Cold War, at a time when there weren't many American journalists that were able to travel to the Eastern Bloc. And week after week, I was crossing the Berlin Wall into Eastern Europe. And during those times, I always had a sense of responsibility and maybe in a way, a sense of being a form of a visual ambassador to actually communicate what people have in common with each other. Not so much their differences, but what unites the world, what unites humanity. And I had this feeling as well when I came to Cuba. Cuba, as we know, is only 90 miles from the country where I was born, the United States. But because of the relations between Cuba and the United States and the American embargo for the last 50 years, unfortunately, this has been a world that for a long time was actually not very accessible to a lot of people in the West, particularly a lot of Americans. So when I came here, I was delighted by this opportunity to really discover the people of Cuba and their spirit and their culture. And in fact, something that has been a constant for me, I've now been coming to Cuba for the last 30 years. 4 years ago, in many ways, just like I would say like at the end of the 80s with the Eastern Bloc, I had a sense that this was going to be a fundamental moment of history in Cuba. So I've made now 20 trips to Cuba in the last 4 years. And what has struck me most about my visits here are really two things. I would say that the spirit of the Cuban people, what I see when I walk the streets of Havana, when I walk the streets and when I encounter people, what I witness and what I see is an amazing sense of human dignity, of vibrance, of elegance, joy, people that are in movement, people that love life, but also people that don't only view the world through the prism of thinking about life as an individual, but also thinking about life as a community. And something that I feel that I've had an amazing opportunity to really discover the heart of Cuba. And the heart of Cuba actually has really touched my own heart. And every time that I leave Cuba, I have this sense of having had a beautiful lesson of life. I don't say that everything is perfect. Things are not perfect in any country around the world. Every country has its problems. My own country of origin has many problems.
I wonder, there's a lot of, now even more, of attention over Cuba, and a lot of media and photographers are coming and doing a lot, and it looks like Cuba, everyone wants to take a picture. And it's like so many things are interesting for foreigners. Essentially, we Cubans, we don't see that much because we live here. But there's a lot of that vision, and I would say sadly, of Cuba, of folklorism, of old stuff, of old country, of things, something stuck in the past. So buildings without any painting on it, old cars, symbols of the past, even though Cuba is much more than that. And I've seen in your pictures a lot of faces, essentially, much more than other stuff, faces. What do you think about this perspective that a lot of your colleagues have towards Cuba, that is very touristic towards Cuba, in front of what you do?
First of all, it's in many ways very understandable that that people that come to Cuba are immediately struck by the notion of many old cars and the architecture. It's without a doubt the reality of Cuba, because of the embargo and because of the fact that so many of the kind of physical aspects of the country are still rooted in the late 1950s and 1960s. In a world now where everything looks the same, in this world of globalization, the reality is that actually we all have somewhat of a thirst of something that feels authentic. And I think what a lot of people really love when they come to Cuba is this notion of not everything looking the same, that there is a true feeling of authenticity. But what I hope in my own work related to Cuban life, I have recently published a book of 30 years of photographs called Cuba, A Grace of Spirit. And in many ways, the title speaks very, very strongly to how I feel about the world that I witness in Cuba. And that is actually not so much about old cars and about architecture and many of these stereotypes, but it's about actually the spirit of Cuban people. And for me, what is one of the things that is really interesting when I come here is a sense of an opportunity to learn how to live life in a better way. Yes, there are problems in Cuba. Yes, there are economic challenges, but there are also many problems in the United States, and there are many problems in Western Europe. What I love and what I feel here in Cuba is that I actually think, and I think this, what I'm going to say is not underlined often enough by people coming to visit Cuba, is that whatever the realities are politically in this country, I actually believe very strongly that the power of the ideas of the Cuban Revolution were very beautiful. The ideology of the revolution was a beautiful ideology. And it spoke in many ways to living as a community, to not thinking about life only in a material sense, and in an individual sense, but to recognize the fact that we all live together. And you can see this in the streets of Cuba. Just 2 days ago, I was walking in central Havana, and I heard a little bit of noise, and I walked, and I looked through a gate, and I saw a group. This was at 9 o'clock in the morning. I saw a group of probably 30 to 40 senior citizens, everyone that were from the age of about 70 to 90. And they were having their morning exercise together. And I stopped and I made photographs of this scene. And all of these elder people were laughing and feeling joyful, and they were moving together, and they were living together. And this wasn't a scene of solitude. This wasn't a scene of being old by yourself and life was sad and over. This was a scene of people enjoying life together. And this was a very Cuban reality. And I think it's important that we realize that this country has so much to teach other people in many ways.
Of all the pictures you've made in Cuba, what kind of circumstance or coincidence or instant or moment was the most exciting or touching for you that you had to make a picture out of it?
I would say something happens very often when I'm walking in Cuba, when I'm walking in the streets of Havana. I like to walk quietly. I like to walk by myself. My Spanish isn't so bad. I can communicate. But what happens to me so often is that I will see people that for one reason or another, their dignity, their elegance, their humanity moves me. People in the streets of Havana, for example. And I will approach them and I will very gently say hello. And then very often there's this very quiet moment where my eyes connect with their eyes. And so much is expressed, so much is communicated without saying a word. And what I love about the Cuban spirit is this sense of welcoming one's brother and one's sister, that we're all part of the human family. And people don't seem to be afraid of life. They don't seem to be afraid of each other. They welcome contact. And there is a notion of fraternity and sisterhood that I think is really beautiful. And we live today in a world, and I don't mean to be nostalgic about the past, but with all of the positive aspects of technology, we also live in a world today where everyone is on their cell phone and texting each other and spending their time in front of a computer with email. And in Cuba, when I walk around the streets, I see people like literally sitting and talking to each other. There's communication. People communicate with dance. They communicate with music. They communicate with their family, with the people they love, with their friends, with their neighbors. And there is, again, I want to underline this sense that we don't live only as individuals, but we live as a member of a community. Something that has really struck me in Cuba. Wherever you go in the world, if an old person falls down, people will help them. But I have seen at least 10 times walking in the streets of Havana, if an old person falls, people run from all directions to pick them up. And this is this notion of a sense of responsibility for each other that I think is very beautiful.
You have this habit in Cuba, Peter, a very Cuban hobby. And our audience would not imagine that you go to a very crowded dancing, salsa, or another music place called La Tropical, which is a very popular place to go. Why?
I have a twin brother, David, and my twin brother, David, is also a photographer. He happens to be one of my favorite photographers in the world, and we've had the great good fortune to share our passion for both life and the world and photography now since we were both 16 years old. And David came to Cuba about 10 years ago, and he discovered this one dance club in Havana called La Tropical, Salon Rosado Benimori La Tropical. And it's a place actually that isn't so well known by the rest of the world, and it's a very popular working class dancing club on the outskirts of Havana. But my brother spent 6 months doing a film about this club, and it's a really beautiful film, which is called La Tropical. And he discovered that, in fact, La Tropical was the cathedral salsa music and dance in Cuba. All of the great Cuban dance groups, Los Banban, La Chalaga Habanera, and many, many more, all started at the La Tropical. And I love to go to La Tropical. I go many times on Sunday afternoons, and there's a matinee, and I often stay late. It's an outdoor amphitheater. It's not a place where tourists go. It's a place that's very, very Cuban. But it is an amazing cross-section of the human spirit that comes together to dance with sensuality, with exuberance, with joy. And when I'm there, I see people of all ages, people that are 19 years old, all the way to people that are 90 years old, with a smile on their face because they're dancing together with music and they're in movement. And those moments really give me a lot of hope.
There's this thing happening between Cuba and the United States publicly since December 17th that has shortened the distance between the two countries, the reestablishment of diplomatic relations, and much more, because people talk a lot about the government-government dialogue, but it's a much more complicated and diverse contact with the U.S. It's culture, it's people. How do you feel about that, being you, an American that has been coming to Cuba since 1989?
Well, I think this is a very key moment in the history of Cuba, and also in many ways in the history of the world. And I think there are several things. First of all, one of the reasons why I love photography is that I'm able to frame a moment that I see. I don't invent reality. I witness it as it is. So rather than discuss my own ideas, I'm more interested in communicating a reflection of what I see and what I feel. What I see and what I feel at this moment in Cuba is a sense of great potential. I have a sense of a country of people that truly love their country. I think Cubans are extremely proud to be Cuban in general. And I think that something that everyone around the world should understand is that there is very much about Cuba that Cubans love and respect. I think I have the sense that the Cuban people are excited by change. I think, like we all are. Everyone around the world is excited by a sense of opportunity. And I think many people in Cuba are excited by a sense of economic opportunity and economic progress. But I also think that what Cubans tell me when I speak to them in the streets of Havana, when I walk, when I'm in a taxi, is that there are many things in this country that they're very proud of. They're very proud of national institutions of healthcare and education. And I'm hoping that as this country goes forward, I always say that I'm hoping that history will be as kind to Cuba as Cuba has been to me. And I hope that my hope for Cuba would be that many of these really strong national institutions that protect everyone, national institutions of healthcare and education, that there will be a continuity of those things along with greater economic progress. What I'm hoping, though, for Cuba is that many of these underlying powerful ideas of the revolution that spoke about a notion of equality, that people have equal opportunity, that one is judged by the content of one's character, not necessarily by one's social class, or that we're not necessarily defined by our job. I'm hoping that actually in the future of Cuba that change will also be change that will be accessible with positive, creative opportunity for everyone. I also think, though, that it's not only an opportunity for Cuba. I think it's a great opportunity for the United States, and I think it's a great opportunity for the rest of the world. I really believe that Americans have as much to learn from Cuba as the opposite. And I'm hoping that we can learn from each other.
Imagine there are a lot of journalists coming to Cuba to discover an island that was not known, and it's starting to create an image of Cuba inside the United States. It's like a discovery something that was right there, but we did not know anything. And the big guys, New York Times, and also mainstream TV networks are coming here to tell their stories. Discoveries are making a lot of shows. If you have this, you know Cuba, it's not like you're discovering this. You know Cuba very much, and that makes you in a way a pioneer. Actually, you're the first American photographer to be exhibiting as a solo artist here in Cuba. If a colleague calls you and asks you, I've seen a lot, it's pretty much the same, from the visits of the celebrities, and the same thing all the time, all cars, all buildings, images of political leaders, essentially that's what, and beautiful beaches. What is the picture that you recommend to make that will synthesize, will tell how Cuba is? If a colleague asks you to give you the light, to ask you for the light of the Cuban reality.
I'll give you what I think is maybe one of the best examples of a lesson of life that one can learn in Cuba that doesn't touch upon old cars and doesn't touch upon architecture. I love to dance. I love music and I like to dance myself. And I don't like solitude. I love the idea of being in a community of people. And every Sunday that I have ever been in Havana, I go to dance on a Sunday afternoon. And I recall one time, this is a very good example, I wanted to go to La Tropical. And La Tropical was closed on that particular Sunday because they were doing some reconstruction. So a friend of mine told me that there was a park where we could go where there was also an outdoor dance floor. So we went to this park. And we walked into this small area that was very simple. It was just like a square of cement. And there was a chair and there was a radio with salsa music. And sitting around this park were tables and chairs of about 200 men and women that were all of the age of, I would say, from 20 to about 90 years old. And they didn't know each other, but they simply had come on a Sunday to this park. And I walked into this area, and I began to invite women of all ages to dance salsa with me, people I never had met before. And all afternoon for 4 hours, every single person that I invited to dance said yes with a smile on their face. And during the moment of a dance, we enjoyed each other, and we enjoyed being together, and we enjoyed music, and we enjoyed dancing. And for me, this was a beautiful example of life. It wasn't an example of living in a neighborhood alone and having nothing to do and feeling solitude and not communicating with one's neighbor. It was an example of really living in a community. And this is the kind of thing that I think that one can discover in Cuba. And I would encourage, another thing that I would encourage any visitor here to do would be not to take one of the, ironically, it wouldn't be to take one of the public official taxis. It would be to jump into an old American 1950s car with common Cuban people that don't know each other, and to pile into a car together one by one, and to be in one of these almendron, one of the, they call them almonds, where the taxi driver drops everyone off one by one where they live. And all of the people in the car, they don't know each other, but during the course of a taxi ride, everyone speaks to each other, the radio is blasting with salsa music, and for me, this is Cuba.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much.